Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive this week. We're going to be jumping into some of the big changes happening with U.S. immigration policy. President Trump is back in the White House. And, well, let's just say he's not wasting any time, making some moves. We're talking border closures, expanded deportation powers, crackdowns on sanctuary cities, even troops hitting the ground. It's a lot to unpack, for sure. So to help us make sense of it all, we've got our expert here with us today. They're amazing at, connecting the dots, giving us the why behind the what. So big question, is this crackdown actually feasible? Or is it more like political theater?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, the answer is probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me, at least, is that, it's seeing kind of echoes of Trump's first term, but it feels amplified this time around, Not just a return to those same policies, but like a real doubling down.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little. Starting with that executive order on the border, quote, immediately repel, repatriate, and remove illegal aliens across the southern border. I mean, that's strong language, even for Trump.
It is, yeah. It really signals, I think, a return to that zero-tolerance approach we saw before. The goal seems to be to deter migrants by any means necessary. One of the first things to go was the CBP One app. Remember that system that was supposed to make applying for asylum, more orderly? Yeah, it's gone. Completely scrapped. No new appointments. Existing ones canceled.
I'm trying to picture what that means for someone who's already traveled. I mean, hundreds, maybe thousands of miles, risking everything to get here.
Right. It's hard to fathom. Well, one of the sources you sent had this story of Nady. She's a Venezuelan mother who arrived in San Diego after this harrowing journey, only to find out her asylum appointment gone. Just imagine that desperation, feeling like the door slammed in your face after everything you've been through.
Heartbreaking, really. And this is all happening on top of ending catch and release, right? Mm-hmm. To be honest, I'm not totally clear on what that means.
Oh, sure.
Could you break that down for me and for our listeners?
So catch and release was basically the practice of releasing migrants into the U.S. while they waited for their immigration court hearings. The argument is that it incentivized illegal immigration and created this huge backlog in the courts.
Okay, so if they're not being released, then what happens to them?
They're being detained.
Yeah.
Which creates this massive logistical challenge, of course. I mean, where do you hold all these people? And then you have these organizations like Catholic Charities that used to help receive released migrants, and now they're being told they can't help.
Wow, so you have these groups with resources ready to help, and the government's basically tying their hands.
Exactly. It just adds another layer of complexity to an already really complex situation. And it makes you wonder, is this really about efficiency? Or is it more about sending a message?
It sounds like the message is don't even try.
Right. Deterrence. The administration is betting that if they make the process difficult enough, uncertain enough, people will just give up.
But what about those who are already here? People who've built lives in the U.S. We keep hearing about ICE being unleashed, but what does that actually mean on the ground?
It means a significant expansion of their enforcement powers. That quote from Tom Homan, the White House border czar, as he's called, it really says it all. The gloves are off. We're seeing a return to policies that allow ICE to make arrests in sensitive locations, places like schools and churches.
There was that story we read about Erin, that Chicago teacher learning how to react if ICE agents show up at her school. I mean, that must be terrifying for teachers, parents, students.
Absolutely.
Right.
It creates this climate of fear and uncertainty that just permeates everything. And then you add in the expansion of expedited removal.
Oh, can you explain what that is?
Sure.
What does that mean exactly?
So expedited removal is a process that allows for faster deportation without a hearing before an immigration judge. It used to be used in more limited circumstances, but now it can apply to anyone who can't prove they've been in the U.S. for at least 2 years continuously.
So someone like, let's say, name from source material, the person we read about who's built a life here for years, contributing to their community, they could be deported without even seeing a judge. Just like that.
That's the reality under these new policies, yeah. And it raises some serious questions about due process and fairness.
This all feels like a massive show of force. But at what cost? Is the system even equipped to handle this?
That's a good question. I mean, we're talking potentially millions of people here.
Yeah.
Detaining them, processing them, deporting them. It all takes resources, manpower, coordination. Is the system even set up to handle that kind of volume?
Yeah, and that's a really crucial point. It gets to the heart of whether this whole crackdown is even feasible. Logistically speaking, the challenges are just massive. You'd need a huge increase in detention facilities, more immigration judges, more ICE agents. All of that costs money.
Money that may not be there.
Right. And then there's the potential for legal battles every step of the way. Civil liberties groups are already gearing up to fight these policies in court. We could easily see a wave of lawsuits that just clog up the system for years. So even if the administration has the will to do all this, they might not have the way.
Exactly. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. The system just isn't designed for this kind of mass deportation effort.
What about the economic side of things? I mean, we're talking about removing potentially millions of people from the workforce. That got to have some serious ripple effects.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the industries that rely heavily on immigrant labor. Agriculture, construction, hospitality. What happens to those businesses when they lose a big chunk of their workforce?
And what about the families, the communities?
Right. The human impact is just enormous. Families being torn apart, children traumatized, communities destabilized.
It's a lot to consider. It makes me wonder if the administration has really thought this through, or are they just reacting emotionally, driven by ideology rather than practical considerations?
It's a question a lot of people are asking. Honestly, there's evidence to support both sides. On the one hand, these are policies Trump has talked about for years. They're at the core of his political identity.
So there's definitely an ideological element.
No doubt. But at the same time, there's also a level of political calculation here. Trump knows that immigration is a hot-button issue for his base. He knows that taking a hard line will energize his supporters and maybe distract from other issues.
So it's a win-win for him politically, even if it turns out to be a disaster practically.
That's one way to look at it. But there's another piece of this we haven't really talked about yet, and that's the role of the Justice Department. They're the ones who will ultimately be responsible for enforcing all of these policies. And it's not entirely clear that they're on board.
Wait, so you're saying there could be resistance from within the DOJ?
It's possible.
Yeah.
Keep in mind the DOJ is made up of career lawyers and civil servants. A lot of them have dedicated their lives to upholding the law, protecting civil liberties. They might not be comfortable with policies that they see as overreach or even outright illegal.
So you could have a situation where the administration is pushing these policies, but the people who are actually supposed to enforce them are dragging their feet, maybe even actively working against them.
Exactly. It just adds another layer of complexity to an already really complex situation.
Wow, that would be a twist.
It would, and it gets at the deeper tensions here. This isn't just about immigration. It's about the balance of power in our government. The executive branch versus the judicial branch, the federal government versus the states, and ultimately it's about the people versus those in power.
And speaking of the people, what about sanctuary cities? They're on the front lines of this fight. How are they responding to this crackdown?
They're pushing back hard. They're arguing that the administration is exceeding its authority, that they have a right to set their own policies, and that they won't be bullied into cooperating with these mass deportations.
DOJ is threatening legal action, right? They're saying that sanctuary cities are breaking federal law.
They are. And that sets the stage for a major legal showdown.
Yeah.
One that could go all the way to the Supreme Court. The administration is relying on the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which basically says federal law trumps state law.
But sanctuary cities are saying this is overreach, that the federal government is going beyond its authority.
Right. And they're pointing to the 10th Amendment, which reserves certain powers to the states. It's a classic federalism debate. It'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out.
So we've got a potential legal showdown brewing between the federal government and sanctuary cities. And we've got potential resistance from within the DOJ itself. This is getting complicated.
It is. And we haven't even talked about the troops going to the border. What are they actually doing there? What authority do they have? Are they going to be directly involved in arrests?
And what kind of message does that send, both to migrants and to the American people? Is it just a show of force, or is there a real strategic purpose?
These are all important questions, and honestly, the answers aren't clear yet. But one thing's for sure, this is a story that's just beginning to unfold.
All right, so we're back. And continuing to explore these big changes in immigration policy, we've covered a lot of ground already at the border, ICE, sanctuary cities. And it's clear this is a complex story with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, it really is. And I think what's really striking is just the sheer scale of what the administration is trying to do here. We're not just talking about, tweaking existing policies.
Yeah.
This is like a fundamental shift in how America approaches immigration.
And it seems to be moving towards a much more well, I guess restrictive and punitive approach.
Definitely. The message is pretty clear. We're going to make it as hard as possible to get into the country illegally. And if you're already here without authorization,
Yeah.
or you can be living in fear of deportation.
But can they actually pull that off? I mean, can they really achieve that level of deterrence? We talked about the logistical hurdles, the legal challenges, the economic fallout. It seems like they're biting off more than they can chew.
That's a real possibility. And
Yeah.
that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating. It's a huge gamble. The administration is betting that they can overcome all these obstacles, that they can just force the system to do what they want.
But what happens if they can't? What if this all backfires?
Well, the consequences could be pretty significant. We could see a total breakdown of the immigration system, a flood of court cases, backlash from businesses, maybe even unrest in the streets.
It feels like we're standing on a precipice here.
In a way, I think we are. This is a turning point for immigration in America. The decisions made over the next few weeks and months are going to have a huge impact, not just on immigrants themselves, but on the very fabric of our society.
And it's not just about policies either, right? It's about people. We can't lose sight of the human cost of all of this. We're talking about families being ripped apart, children living in fear, individuals being denied basic human rights.
Exactly. Behind all the statistics and the headlines, there are real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
Yeah.
And those stories need to be heard. Their experiences need to be understood.
So what can our listeners do if they're concerned about all of this? Where can they turn? What actions can they take?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed, stay engaged, read articles, watch documentaries, talk to people who are being affected by these policies.
Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. The more you understand the issues, the better equipped you'll be to advocate for change.
What about concrete actions? What can people do to make their voices heard?
There are a lot of options. You can contact your elected officials, let them know what you think. You can donate to organizations that are providing legal aid and support to immigrants. You can volunteer your time at a local refugee resettlement agency.
So even though this feels like something that's being decided way up top, there are still things that everyday people can do to make a difference.
Absolutely. Change always starts from the bottom up. It happens when people speak out, when they get organized, when they demand better from their leaders.
And speaking of leaders, we've talked a lot about Trump and his administration, but they're not the only players here. What about Congress? What role do they play?
Well, Congress has a crucial role in shaping immigration policy. They can pass laws, allocate funding, hold hearings, investigate the administration's actions.
So even though Trump is setting the agenda, Congress can still push back, modify his proposals, maybe even block them entirely.
In theory, yes. But in reality, it's more complicated than that. Congress is very divided on immigration. It's not clear that they'll be able to come together and pass any meaningful legislation.
So it's a stalemate.
Not necessarily. Public pressure can make a big difference. If enough people raise their voices, if they demand action from their representatives, it can really change the political landscape.
So it comes back to the power of the people again.
It always does. In a democracy, the people are the ultimate authority. Their voices matter, their votes matter, their actions matter.
That's a powerful message, and a hopeful one.
It is. Because even though we're facing some serious challenges, even though things might seem overwhelming at times, we can't give up hope. We have to believe that change is possible, that we can create a more just and compassionate immigration system.
And that we can do it together.
Exactly. Together, we can make a difference.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, we encourage you to keep this conversation going. Talk to your friends, your family, your coworkers. Share what you've learned. And don't be afraid to speak up for what you believe in. The future of immigration in America is in our hands.